YouTube, welcome back to my channel, Taylor Talks Tales. Today I have my fall horror book recommendations video for you. Super excited to be doing this because it's a combination of several things I love. I love fall, specifically October, and Halloween's my favorite holiday, and I just think this is a great time of year to read, and of course, it's horror everything, which is awesome. I'm somebody who reads horror year-round, but there's just something extra special about reading books that are in the horror genre this time of year. So, really excited to be doing this. I do want to mention I tried my best to cater this list towards books that I personally like to read in the fall, and books that really give me that fall and autumn sense, like they're very evocative of certain things that are very fall to me. So there are certain awesome horror masterpieces that are not on here because, like, The Shining, for instance, I consider to be more of a winter horror book. So for me, it's not going to be on this list. And this list is not comprehensive. These are just some books that I happen to really like, and hopefully you guys can find something, because today is October 24th, which means we have 1 week till Halloween. So maybe you guys can pick out a couple of books to read between now and then. So anyway, let's get into the video. So, to get started, the first three books, they are all part of a trilogy, and it's funny that I'm recommending a trilogy because I normally tend to prefer standalones, but this is a really enjoyable trilogy that would be perfect for this time of year, especially the first one. And it's the Pine Deep trilogy by Jonathan Mayberry. So you have Ghost Road Blues, Dead Man's Song, and Bad Moon Rising. These three books are very enjoyable, very fast-paced. Once you get into them, they are definitely very fall and Halloween focused, especially on Halloween. The first book, as I'm not going to talk about the second two, but the first book takes place in a small town called Pine Deep, and 60 years before there was someone who was brutally murdered after a series of murders, and it's a lot more complicated than that, but this town ends up developing a love of the macabre and a love of Halloween. They rely on it for tourism and their income. They have the biggest haunted house slash corn maze hayride in America, and it's so cute. Like, this is a really interesting town, and it does get to be pretty brutal. I love the opening to this. I'm not going to spoil it. You should enjoy it yourself, but I thought it was a really great way to start out the series. And it's by Jonathan Mayberry, and I really like his Rotten Ruin series. This trilogy, these were his first books that he wrote, or at least this Ghost Road Blue was his first novel, so hopefully you guys can pick these books up, because I think that they don't get as much recognition as they should, and I think these would be just perfect for this time of year. Great atmosphere, lots of spooky stuff. There's things that are happening at a haunted hayride, corn maze, so they'll be perfect. So hopefully you can get your hands on these books. This next book, this is one of the books, most of these are purely horror, some are a little cross-genre. This one is not necessarily horror, but I read it all the time. I love this book, it's one of my favorite books, and that is Night Film by Marisha Pessl. This book is perfect for this time of year. I've always read it this time of year. It just, for me, it's a perfect autumn book. It takes place in the fall, if I remember correctly, and there's just so many interesting things happening. Pretty much in this book we follow an investigator who's trying to investigate the death of a mysterious underground film director's daughter, but it looks like there may be some supernatural happening, something else behind it, and he's just trying to solve the mystery of it. But there are definitely some very creepy scenes in this, and if you love horror movies like I do, I love them just as equally as I do horror books. So for me, the film aspect was really neat. There are certain pages that are like this, and there's an online component, and I just love this book. And again, it has that great atmosphere. There's a lot of mystery, and it's a very thought-provoking book, and I love it. One of my favorites. I will always recommend this book, so definitely give this one a shot, even if it's not necessarily a purely horror film. I still think horror fans will like it. I think there's a huge crossover between fans of horror liking this book, because it definitely is a thriller, and some scenes are pretty creepy. So this next book is Night in the Lonesome October by Roger Zelazny. I love this one. I think it has a great atmosphere. It is not a purely horror book, but it has horror elements in it, and there's also a lot of like dark fantasy and a lot of homages to other characters from horror classics. And I really like this book. I read it for the first time last year, and this is one of my rereads for this month because I really enjoyed it and really loved it. It follows, our main character is a dog, actually, so it's told from his perspective, and he is the familiar to this very mysterious man who could potentially be kind of like a Jack the Ripper character. But there's this big contest that's happening on the 31st of October, and he goes around and interacts with other familiars, and there are people dying, and it's just really cool, and you're trying to unravel what's going on, and I love it. Great atmosphere, perfect for this time of year, and the fact that it has some Halloween elements and concludes on Halloween is just awesome. So definitely give this one a shot. It is a well done, underrated, and underappreciated classic book in my opinion. This next one is Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. This one, if you liked Midsummer or The Wicker Man or like some of those like folk horror stories, you'll really like this one. And it also takes place leading up to the Harvest Festival, so it is leading up towards a fall situation. But it explores the themes of, you know, couple who are disenchanted with the big city moving to a rural area, and it's a very small town that has a lot of quirks and weird things happening. It is a little bit of a slower paced novel for a good chunk of it, but when it ramps up, it really does. Very similar to The Wicker Man, which I happen to really like that movie. Talking about the classic one, not the 2006 version with Nick Cage, but the one that came out in the like mid-70s. I love that movie. And this one, I think, is kind of the closest one to it, except for I think there may be a novelization of The Wicker Man, but if you liked that movie, you'll really like this one. It has great atmosphere, small town atmosphere, rural and folk horror, and overall it's just a very fun, enjoyable novel and very underrated. These next two are both by the same author, and there's a third book that I also would recommend as well that I will post up here, but I am currently lending the copy out that I have to my friend. And fall is not complete without some Ray Bradbury, and so my two recommendations are one of his most famous books, which is Something Wicked This Way Comes, and The October Country. And then the third book that should be here is The Halloween Tree, which is just a perfect Halloween read, and I do recommend that a lot. These two are pretty much classics. The October Country has a lot of short stories, some of his best short stories, aside from like The Illustrated Man, which also has some of his best short stories in my opinion. I love both. And there are definitely some creepy stories in here. They aren't all strictly horror, but a lot of them do have that good atmosphere, and I think Ray Bradbury is a master at telling short stories. Some of them are very creepy, and a couple of them have to do with fall time as well, so this is a great one to read right now. And then, of course, Something Wicked This Way Comes. I mean, there are whole entire passages talking about fall and autumn people, and dealing with the carnival, and creepy man wanting to steal your soul, and candy, and Halloween, and it's just an awesome book, coming of age story, and I like to read it. I also enjoy the movie version as well that came out a long time ago. I don't even remember what it was, but it's a classic film that you should check out. The movie and the book differ a little bit, just like with all stories, but this one is very good. Next books I have here, not all of them are necessarily set in autumn, but I love reading these books in the fall because they are some of my favorite horror books, and even though they are young adult and it's part of a series, it's just, I love it, especially the first three. I think the fourth is a little weak, but I love these books so much. It is the Monstromologist Series by Rick Yancey. So we have The Monstromologist, The Curse of the Wendigo, The Isle of Blood, and The Final Descent. And I think for me, the reason why these books really seem to feel like fall to me is that they take place in New England, and they are very, like, the writing is very atmospheric and definitely quite graphic. There's a lot of monster action happening in these, and I don't know what it is, but I just always crave these books right around this time of year. I think they are just perfect for reading in the fall, but you could read them year round, and they have that kind of like gloomy New England weather, which is something that I associate with fall as well, because living in Washington, that's kind of like how our fall is, but with some pretty colors. But it definitely gets cold and rainy and gloomy, and when I think of stories like that, it makes me think of fall oftentimes. So these books follow our main characters. We have Will Henry, and he works for Dr. Palinor Winthrop, and he loses his parents in a horrific accident, and he's working for the doctor, and one night there's a body that is brought in, and there's something very odd about it, and that's when the doctor reveals that he is a monstromologist, and he basically hunts monsters, but for science. He has a very scientific view of monsters, that they aren't these supernatural aberrations, but they come from the natural world. And then in this story, anyway, I won't talk about the other books because they're part of the series, but in this one, there is this type of monster that takes over graveyards, and it was so creepy. The first time I read this book, I was 18, going off to college, so it was fall time, and it is one of the few books that I actually had dreams about it afterwards, because I'm usually pretty immune to that. So definitely give these books a shot. I think they would be great this time of year, and they are my favorite young adult horror books for sure. I like to read a bunch of classic stories in the fall as well, so a lot of horror classics are on this list, starting with the scary stories. Treasury. I read these books when I was a kid at school, usually back to school, and they were around, September, October, November, that kind of time period. So for nostalgic purposes, I like to check these books out, and they're really great if you just want to sit down for like 15 minutes or less and read a story or two if you don't have a lot of time. This is a great way to just get a couple creepy books or creepy stories in a short amount of time. And these are classic, and I love them. I have some of them memorized now, but I still enjoy flipping through these, especially for the very creepy drawings. I mean, some of these are just going to haunt me forever. Ugh. Harold, if you look at that one, or like the creepy rat pet. I mean, just, they're perfect. I mean, look at the lady on the cover. So definitely give these a shot if you haven't already, because they're awesome. Keeping up with the theme of classics, I have Edgar Allan Poe, his selected writings. There's several variations of this book, Tales of Mystery and Imagination. All of his work for me, I automatically associate Poe with fall. I think because I did 2 units of studying Poe, one in middle school and one in high school, and both those times took place in October. So for me, I just built that association up in my head. So I think revisiting Poe is always awesome. And one of my favorite high school teachers, Mr. Rosenzweig, he did this wonderful telling and performance of The Raven that I will always remember. It was awesome. So definitely give Poe a shot if you haven't read his work before. Some of his poems are awesome. He is a great storyteller, especially with his short stories. So some definite classics that I recommend you give him a shot if you haven't already. Another classic is Dracula by Bram Stoker, which I love this cover. This is my favorite edition of this book because I actually have 3 copies of Dracula. I don't know why. I love Dracula. It's super gothic and moody and atmospheric, and again, another classic that I remember reading in school in the fall. My teachers liked to time things that way, and it was really awesome, so I will just always associate Dracula with fall. And this one is probably one of my favorite classic horror novels that are like significantly older, and I think it holds up. I think it ages really well, and I just love the style of it being written in letter format, and it is a classic book that I think is classic for a reason. And even if it is slower paced, for me, I don't mind that because I enjoyed the story. And I also try oftentimes to pretend I'm a Victorian while I'm reading this, and I hadn't really heard about vampires a whole lot, so it kind of makes the reveal more exciting. But it's just an overall awesome story, and you know, it's one of my favorite classic horror novels, you know, from the 1800s. So highly recommend. Give it a shot if you haven't already. Okay, the last book of the classics. I have H.P. Lovecraft. This is my annotated version. I have several versions of H.P. Lovecraft's books, but I really like this one in particular. It's just really pretty and well put together, and I liked the annotations a lot. But I think H.P. Lovecraft is perfect for this time of year. A lot of his stories are around the Massachusetts area, and so it has that like moody, atmospheric feel to them, very gloomy and dreary, and of course you're dealing with madness and all kinds of things like that, and supernatural creatures, elder gods, you name it. So I think this is a great choice to read this time of year, especially if you don't have time for full novels. A lot of his short stories are pretty quick reads, pretty easy to get into, and you know, I'm a big fan of Lovecraft and cosmic horror, and this is always something that I like to turn to in the fall. The next 3 recommendations are by Stephen King. I limited myself to 3 because I didn't want to have Stephen King or any one author completely take over this list. And these are the 3 that I always think of when I think of Stephen King and fall books. These are the 3 for me. So we have Pet Sematary, Needful Things, and Under the Dome. So, for Under the Dome, this actually takes place in autumn, and it plays a little bit of a role in the story. Not much, but it's the background of the story. So for me, like, I just have a lot of images of this small, idyllic, beautiful town, like New England town, being just torn apart by people and being stuck under a dome, and it takes place in the fall, and so that's why I like reading it. Plus it's really thick, and I tend to read bigger books in the fall, and so I have that association with Under the Dome, and it's a good one. I think it's an underrated book of Stephen King's. A lot of his other stories tend to get more love, but I liked this one. It's not for everybody, but it worked for me. Needful Things is one of my favorite Stephen King books. I am a big Needful Things lover. I will praise this book all the time. I think there's should be more love of this book. I think it's one of his best. It just clicked for me. It has a lot of tropes that I really enjoy. And this one also takes place in fall. In fact, the store Needful Things opens up, I think, on October 9th. So that also plays a role in this. So, you know, for me, I like to read it in October or November, right around fall time, to kind of go through things that the characters are going through, you know, right around the time they're happening. So, awesome read. Definitely give it a shot if you haven't. And, you know, one of my favorite Stephen King's. And this last one is Pet Sematary. I put this on this list mainly because I do feel like this one is very atmospheric and dark and gloomy, and there's some scenes in the forest, and I always imagine there being like lots of mist and it being cold and all of that. But this is a classic tale. Stephen King said it's one of his scariest, and I agree. It's definitely a dark and sad book, and you know, I think it's great for this time of year. And you know, I just think the idea of things coming back from the dead not being the same is just a creepy concept. So definitely give this one a shot. And these 3 books are also all by the same author, and again, I limited myself to 3. These are by Robert Mccammon, who is another favorite author of mine, and it's They Thirst, Blue World, and Usher's Passing. So Usher's Passing, it is a kind of retelling / reimagining of the fall of the House of Usher, and this is very gothic and just really does feel like fall. It takes place in the fall in sort of the Appalachian Mountains of, I think, one of the Carolinas, or Virginia, or something along the border of that. And I really liked this one. The pacing's a little slow at times, so it's not going to be for everybody, but I liked it, and I mean, there's some, fall scenes, some Halloween type scenes, and it's definitely it's Robert Mccammon, so he's a great storyteller, and I really enjoyed it, and I really liked how he reimagined the Ushers as this modern day family that got their wealth from firearms, and it takes place basically, I think this book came out in like the 80s, so it's modern day 80s rich people and all of the issues going on with that, and it definitely has a lot of references to the original story and Edgar Allan Poe, and it's awesome, so give this one a go. Blue World I put on here because there is one incredible Halloween story in this, and a couple other fall type stories as well. Robert Mccammon hasn't done a whole lot of short stories. He usually does novels. I really like his short stories. I think they are just as good as his regular novels, and there's some pretty good atmospheric and moody stories in here. A couple that remind me a little bit of like a Twilight Zone episode, so I think these would definitely be some fun books to read right now. And then They Thirst. They Thirst is not one of Robert McCammon's better books. I liked it. It's been a while since I've read this, and the reason why I picked it up is because what is happening, I believe, centers around Halloween. Like, this is basically vampires taking over Los Angeles, but there's some Halloween parties and some other things going on, and I think it would be a good place to start with a Robert Mccammon book if you aren't wanting to get into one of his masterpieces right away. So this is definitely fun and a good vampire book. This next one checks the box on dark academia. Because this is mostly a horror list, I left off books like The Secret History. That's going to be on another video because I'm going to be doing a follow-up video of non-horror fall reads that I really like. But I wanted to put on Bunny by Mona Awad. Finally finished this book. It's a long story as to why it took me so long to read it, but I really liked it. It is insane. It is weird as hell. It is a wild ride. I really loved it, but it's fall and academia, and it plays a bit of a role in the story, so it's not super autumn focused, but I really liked it, and it's just a fun, entertaining, wild ride. It's totally not going to be for everybody because it's a bit out there, but if you like really weird stuff and kind of slightly absurd concepts that are done well, this is a good one. Next we have A Cosmology of Monsters by Sean Hamill. I almost left this one off this list just because it takes place over a period of years. There are definitely some really awesome haunted house scenes in here, and it has like a pretty good build-up, and it's a very quiet horror story. It's practically not a horror story. That's why I almost left it off and was going to put on the other list. But I do feel like, especially with the ending is very horror-esque, I would say, so I did put it on there. But this is pretty much following a kid and his monster friend over many years, and there's definitely a lot of feelings of Halloween, and the family runs this haunted house, and it does tend to take place, it'll jump forward in time, but a lot of the jump forwards still happened in autumn, so that's why I do think this would be a good read for this time of year, especially if you are looking for a very light horror read, something that's not that horrifying, that has almost a kind of cozy feel to it. This would be a fun one. One more classic for you, because I was off on my classic count, and that is Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Other Stories. I like to read this a lot because I was a big fan of The Headless Horseman when I was a kid, and I really like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and I also really like the movie, the Tim Burton movie, and that movie is one I watch every fall as well. It's just so autumnal and perfect. Great stories. They're classics, but when I was a kid, I was able to get into them, so I think they are still pretty approachable, and not all the stories are focused on horror, but a couple of them are, and especially The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Can't get much more Halloween and fall than a headless horseman who has a pumpkin on his head, so awesome book, highly recommend it. The other young adult books on this list: Anna Dressed in Blood and Girl of Nightmares, both by Kendare Blake. I really liked these books. I had no expectations going into them, but I really enjoyed both. I liked the first one a little bit better because the second one started getting into a little too much romance for me, but I still liked both. And if you like this TV show Supernatural, especially the earlier seasons, because I stopped watching after like probably season 8 or 9 just because it kind of grew a little bit boring for me. I don't know why. You'll really like these. And they do have a kind of moody atmosphere. I don't quite remember because it's been a while since I've reread these, if it does take place in the fall, but for me, I read them in the fall, and because they're pretty intense for young adult books at times, like it's pretty bloody, and, you know, basically the main character, he kills ghosts and other supernatural beings, and then he encounters Anna, who kills, she's a ghost who just kills everybody who walks into her place. I don't know, I think it's a really good ghost story. Good modern ghost story, and very approachable for a lot of different people. I also think it's really cool that, at least in my copy of the first book, the writing is in a very dark red to make it very bloody looking, so a lot of fun. And we have the Haunted Forest Tour by James A. Moore and Jeff Strand. This one I put on here mainly because the climax, or basically most of the book happens on Halloween. It doesn't have like a super autumnal or fall feel to it, but it definitely has tons of monsters, and it does take place on Halloween, and there's a lot going on, so this one is good if you were looking for just something just entertaining, something you just want to have fun with, and you just want to see a lot of action and a lot of cool critters and weird monsters. This is the one for you, because basically this follows bunch of people getting killed off after something happens when they're on the Haunted Forest Tour, and they are trying to survive in this haunted forest where all these monsters of various types live. And we have The Ritual by Adam Neville. I only put this one on this list because it takes place in a forest, and it's very rainy and cold throughout the story. I don't even exactly remember what time period of the year this is supposed to take place in, but for me, the feel felt very much like a Pacific Northwest fall, like mid to late fall. So that's why for me, I do think this would be a pretty good read if you're looking for something where there's like a lot of like gloom and rain and cold, and it's pretty much a story following 4 gentlemen trying to survive after they get lost basically in the Scandinavian forest, and they realize they're not alone. This is the other short story collection, and it is Nocturnes by John Connolly. Not all these stories are purely horror, but some are, and they are really, I feel like very few people seem to talk about this short story collection, but it's one of my favorite short story collections. I really like the stories in this. They're all very unique and have, you can tell they're written by John Connolly and by the same author, but they have just different plots, and they're very interesting, and a couple of them do feel very fall and autumnal to me, so really liked reading this book a lot, and I do recommend it. And the last 2 I'm going to say really quick because I am losing my light, unfortunately. I did not time this as well as I should have, but we have What October Brings, and this is put together by Douglas Draw. He is the editor, and these are Lovecraftian stories. Not all of them, just like with other anthology series, not all of them are the best, but the ones that are good are really good. So I'm going to do a review of this book separately and go over which stories I liked and which I didn't care for as much, but this is worth picking up for at least a couple of the short stories, especially towards the beginning. They were really awesome, well done. And the last one I have is October Dreams. This list would not be complete without this book because I revisit this book every year around Halloween. Not all of the stories are the best, but there are some really brilliant ones, very atmospheric, just purely Halloween and fall, and there's ghost stories, monster stories, pretty much there's everything in this book. And so even if it is kind of expensive on Amazon or Powell's or wherever you're shopping for your book depository, I do think it's worth it, and you know, they're very fun stories and very Halloween focused. So give this one a go. I think reading a couple stories leading up to Halloween is a very fun thing to do, and that's what I typically do with this book. So thank you so much for watching this video. I apologize that I have lost the light. I actually may have to refilm this video. We will see what happens, but anyway, these are all the books that I recommend, and I hope you guys have a great evening, and please like, comment, rate, subscribe, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye. Look at that autumn sky. So beautiful.